into what code goes behind building the service bot. So if you have seen my video on how to use service bot, this is more about the technology behind the scenes. So I used AWS Lambda and API Gateway. So these are the serverless computing model, and of course the Slack API. The goals when I was preparing this solution was to have the best practices, and also I wanted to make sure that the solution is robust enough to handle real world scenario. Since it was my first time using Slack, I had a bit of background of AWS Lambda. There are a lot of learnings. I wanted to share those. Also, this code is available in the Git in the public repo. So highlights of my solution was to develop with a serverless model, which is event driven and scalable, and also there has to be a real-time user experience where I run into some issues and I overcome them. The fourth point is of course security, making sure that the platform is available for multiple teams. How do we securely handle? So using the Slack auth mechanism and AWS I'm able to secure the solution. So first step is add to Slack. So what happens is when I do the add to Slack process and I register a new team here, it basically goes through the OAuth process, and in the OAuth process the key thing is to get a callback which registers the information. Now what happens behind the scenes is that the Slack requests one URL, and I process the response and I store the basically exchange the credentials, and the final secure token is stored behind the scene in a DynamoDB table, because later on I have to post messages, I have to communicate with different channels. So all this information is securely stored inside the database, and it's not hard coded anywhere in the code. So that kind of really makes it very robust to handle multiple Slack teams. Then the service alert processing. As I showed, the first step is to get the alert, and here I have used MQTT client, and there is a Lambda function which is called on a rule, and it kind of goes and posts the messages, and it goes into the Slack web API, which is again using those tokens where I am authorized and which channel I am going to post. All this information is retrieved from the DynamoDB and it's posted into the Slack team. So once I have registered, I have the basic entity information there, so I retrieve that and then I post the message. And then of course the formatting of the message with Slack attachments API is again very interesting, where you can put image URLs, you can do the basic formatting and also add hyperlinks and things like that. So that's interesting. So the provision here is to connect to the enterprise software, which is an external database, and collect the real data which is displayed here. The second step was, if you remember, we have to process the vendor codes. So generating this information based on the response from the user. When the user types in yes, Slack posts the message to my event handler. The challenge is that we can't use the WebSocket API with Lambda, and I had to use the events API, which is near real time, and it posts the information as a callback to the Lambda function, and then based on the context, the Lambda function can take an action, whether it's information from the bot or it's a message type is provided. So a lot of APIs are given for you to handle those variations, and based on that you are able to make a judgment what action needs to be taken. So in the previous case, the user said yes, and I had to kind of respond with the message, okay, he wants to see the vendor part, so I prepared the attachments and showed him. So that's the events API. Again, good learning here how to use the events API. The message button. So that was the most interesting part of the whole development. So Slack is very, I would say, less tolerant. So it requires you to respond within 3 seconds, which is all the time you have in terms of responding. So if you hit the recommend button, you have to respond with HTTP 200 within 3 seconds. Otherwise, it gives basic, we have to retry the process again. And to do that, we have to, if we have to get a lot of information, obviously 3 seconds is a constraint, so we have to do something. So I had to kind of have another wrapper function of Lambda, which basically the first function records the information, and then the second function passes the information to the other function, which is actually going to do the process at a later date. I mean, having said that, maybe it responds within 5 to 6 seconds, and then user doesn't really realize whether it's the first invocation or the second invocation. So it's kind of transparent to the user, but at the same time gives you the flexibility. Of course, a lot of learning in terms of how to handle the response. So either you can respond with the body for the buttons, so you can again send back the whole thing and with the modifications. So Slack gives that option. But then if you want to update the information, you can also update with the chat update. So I use the chat update basically to update the existing chat, and we can post new messages. So this was one of the challenges, especially when I am using Java as my virtual JVM is there for the Lambda, and many times the warm-up time itself is almost 2 to 3 seconds. So it's really challenging to implement that. Having said that, with this async mode, it is much better. And then finally, the buyer recommendation is again the same process where we have the chat update and the final approval steps. So the great thing about this chat update I found is that there are no copies of data. There is everything is in sync, and we can kind of update existing information and still kind of reduce the message overload with the user. So that's another feature I kind of appreciated. So that's the overview of the technology. And in terms of development environment, I like to mention I used Eclipse, and fundamentally I really like the feature of which was introduced very recently, which is running this in interactive mode with the live log. So if I execute the function here, I would see a console which is with all the log information, and that's really powerful, because if I'm a developer, I need to access the information. I need to develop something. Instead of going to the CloudWatch and getting the data, this is really a useful feature which was kind of recently added in the Lambda Eclipse plugin. So hope you have this information useful. As I said, I will be putting the code in the Git, and you can contact me with any questions you have. Thank you.